Hey everyone, welcome back. We're going to be talking today about the end of the Cold War. So, this big topic that we've been going on ever since the end of World War II, where the United States and the Soviet Union are kind of at war with each other, but really not at war with each other, but really not getting along. Uh, so, that's going to come to an end in this lesson today, and we're going to kind of see how that goes about. So remember, the whole idea of the Cold War is the United States and our capitalism, which is where people make decisions with what they want to do with their money. They own their own stuff. And the Soviet Union's policy of communism, where the government controls the money, the government controls the jobs, the economy, and those ideas are really against each other all throughout the Cold War. We learned about a lot of topics like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the space race, good stuff, Berlin Wall. So Cold War is going to start coming to an end. How does that happen? Well, the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union starts to improve in the 1970s and 1980s. It was really rocky in the late 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. By the 70s and 80s, it starts to improve. And there's up and down moments. Uh, and the Soviet Union, that's the USSR, starts to make some changes. All right, so you're gonna get a couple fancy words here that you may not ever hear again in your life, unless maybe you're on some kind of game show, and this might win you $1 million. Who knows? But these are some big fancy Russian words, and the first word here is perestroika, which is a fun word to say. Perestroika means restructuring, which is like rebuilding, remaking, changing, shaping. And the Soviet Union is going to restructure its economy slowly throughout this time frame to start giving some more private ownership to people. So that means that they're taking what their communism and making it a little bit more like capitalism in the United States. Slow changes to allow people to have a little bit more control over the products in stores and what's grown in fields, what's made in factories, who owns what. That's the first big change because they realized the United States economy is flat out stronger. In terms of who was doing better, who was making more stuff, who had better stuff. By the 80s, especially, the Soviet Union realized the US was really kind of winning that. So they're going to start, if you can't beat them, you join them. So their communism is going to shift closer to capitalism. And the second fancy word you need to know right here is glasnost. Glasnost. And it means openness. And I try to remember this. I think of like or another word is transparency. Transparency means that you could see through something, and its idea is open. And if you think of a window is made out of glass, and you can see through a window. So that's how I remember glasnost. So openness is they start having new ideas such as crazy thought here, freedom and rights for their people, like what people in the United States had. Because in the Soviet Union before Glasnost, you couldn't say anything bad about the government or you could be arrested. There was no freedom of speech, no freedom of religion, none of that. So they're going to slowly start giving their people more freedom and rights. And if they're restructuring their economy to be more capitalist and giving their people more freedom and rights, then I guess that big gap between the United States and the Soviet Union, which made us not get along, that's slowly coming closer together. So we start to get along a little bit better. So their dictatorship, where one person had total control, starts shifting to democracy, which is where the people have rights and can vote. Big changes. And that guy staring at you right here is the United States president throughout most of the 80s. And his name is Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan was a strong leader in the United States, very bold, not afraid to speak his mind. And he stands up very hard against the USSR. And it's kind of one of those things where, some people, if you're kind of really stand up to them, if you think of like a bully, for example, maybe if you stand up to them, they might leave you alone. It might not work that way. It's kind of a gamble. But the United States, Ronald Reagan kind of says some harsh things about the USSR, but they respect that he's blunt and bold, and he really gains their respect. And he gains the respect of their leader, this guy right here, during the 1980s. And his name, the Soviet Union's leader, was Mikhail Gorbachev. And Mikhail Gorbachev was more open to new ideas than the previous leaders. The Soviet Union had some really strong, mean, tough leaders before. And when Gorbachev comes into power, he's a little more open to new ideas. And that's going to start, again, shifting the Soviet Union a little bit more toward how the United States was set up. And remember that lesson on the Berlin Wall? Remember that big wall that was dividing East and West Berlin, the big capital city of Germany, that separated the Soviet side from the United States and our allies' side? Well, that was built in 1961, and that separated the East and West Berlin. And it was really seen as this big symbol of the entire Cold War, that separation beside people who believed that the United States was right and people who believed that the Soviet Union was right. And that big divide is going to come down in 1989. And this is not the actual official end of the Cold War, but this is really symbolically when the Cold War, people realize, wow, this is really over. And just before this ever happened, there's a famous speech where Ronald Reagan, remember our president at the time, he's in Berlin, in West Berlin on our side, and he says, if you seek peace, I say to you, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And what happens is the people start tearing down this wall, and literally they go out there with sledgehammers, and eventually they get big machines and stuff, but they start just beating down the wall. And unlike what would have happened years before that, the police of the east side of East Germany, they don't go out and arrest the people. They don't go out and shoot the people. They realize at this point it's over and we're going to rejoin. And that's really the best picture of how the Cold War is coming to an end. People on this side and people on this side start to be able to come back together. But there's a little more to it, because the Soviet Union had controlled a bunch of countries. So the Soviet Union is a big, huge country, but they kind of controlled these little countries right in what's called Eastern Europe. Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. They were kind of controlled by the Soviet Union. It's not that they owned them, but they weren't able to be free. The Soviet Union told them what to do. Well, they had tried to have revolutions. For example, in Czechoslovakia, they tried to have a revolution in 1968, I believe. And the Soviet Union sent in their tanks and just were murdering the people. And they gave up on the revolution. But now that things have kind of cooled off in the 80s, when they have these revolutions, the Soviet Union doesn't crush them like they would have done in the past. They kind of realize that it's over and they kind of let it happen. And that slowly they start losing their power. And then the Soviet Union, remember, was made up of a lot of different countries. Russia, in the red here, makes up the majority of it. But all of these other places were their own independent countries: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, and a lot more going down here. And they start declaring their independence. It's similar to how the United States is made up of 50 different states. If California one day says that they're free, well, now we only have 49 states. And would we let them just say they're free, or would there be a war over it, or what? Well, these countries start declaring their independence, and the Soviet Union doesn't go in and try to stop them. And that is the real end of the Cold War. So by 1991, all 15 of the countries that made up of the Soviet Union declare their independence. They all become independent countries, and the Cold War is considered officially over.